Peter R. Breggin, MD, is called the conscience of psychiatry for his many decades of successful reform efforts. His scientific and educational work provide the foundation for modern criticism of drugs and ECT, and lead the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His books include Talking Back to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and now, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety, Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions. Welcome to the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour.
Hello, my wonderful audience out there all over the world. And thank you, PRN, as always, for allowing me to do a radio show and to then use it for my own TV show on YouTube. And this is a part of a new approach that I've been taking, started last week, where I'm going to be doing specific news and information presentations. Tonight's going to be a brief one about things of interest to me that I think will be of interest to you. And then I will do my interview. And the interview is with marvelous Terry Lynch. He was a family practitioner in Ireland. He saw that mostly his patients were having emotional issues. And so he pretty much just dropped out of the psychiatric approach. He got a therapy degree as a therapist, nothing to do with being medical. And he takes a non-medical approach to helping his patients. And I just like him. He's the best. He's warm, he's friendly, he's insightful. We learn from each other when we talk. I have very few colleagues like that and none quite like Terry Lynch. So stay on after my brief intro to what's been happening in the world of Peter Breggin and Ginger Breggin. We have put out two great blogs. One of them is called Coronavirus SOS, Save Us from Governor Cuomo. This was put together largely by Ginger, with doing a lot of research, a lot of listening and watching, and a lot of putting things together to show just how many things have gone wrong in New York State. We talk about it's time for upstate New York to secede. That's probably been going on for a long time, people feeling that way. We want a free state of upstate New York, 6 million of us, compared to about, I think it's 13 million downstate, down around New York City, and where the virus is hitting so badly. And he's trying to impose on us as if we were, a bunch of New Yorkers crammed together, stacked up high and crowding streets every day, and that we need therefore to go into seclusion rather than enjoying our lakes and our rivers and our beautiful hills and mountains and our parks, and going out and enjoying our great restaurants here in Ithaca and so on. So we take the governor to task. And I want to mention just two things to you of special importance. One is Ginger did research on Army experiments decades ago, and she showed that we knew that leaving the underground open, the subway system of New York City open, that within minutes, viruses or bacteria could spread up and down the system and then out into the streets. So not closing the subway system contributed hugely to this catastrophe. And as far as we know, they're just shutting it down at night to clean it. So that's one of the things we go into. It's very interesting. And the other one is the nursing homes and the health department under Cuomo making this insane edict that nursing homes could not turn down patients with the coronavirus. They were not even allowed to test patients before they came in or if they returned from home. And furthermore, they allowed hospitals to send patients to nursing homes, and the nursing homes could not turn them down. And that's a big part of why yesterday, for example, we heard, or maybe early morning today, that 1,700 patients had died that day in nursing homes. Part of it is about, I don't know, not wanting to use hospital beds properly if they're complaining and getting a hospital ship and getting this giant hospital constructed in New York City. Uh, they hardly used it. Instead, they put people in our nursing homes. And by the way, they knew it wasn't going to work out well because with the materials for the coronavirus protection, which was certainly insufficient, nobody was trained to use them anyway, they sent body bags. So read about it. And then we put out yet another blog because we had learned more about some of the reasoning that was behind doing this. And it has to do with being politically correct. Part of it was not to be prejudiced against coronavirus patients. At least that's some of what we've gleaned. This is a remarkable conclusion that I come to at the end of the blog, that we have gotten so obsessed with being politically correct that we're killing people with political correctness. Well, that's my short report for today. And now I'm going to move on to my really wonderful interview with my friend across the ocean, Terry Lynch. Welcome, my wonderful, wonderful audience again. Today, I have a guest that I truly love. He's just a warm, caring human being and a psychotherapist. And Terry Lynch, MD, is a physician in Ireland. You're looking at him now, and he's as warm and friendly as he seems. I'm sure he helps people by his mere presence. Terry started out as a general physician and got more and more to see how much the problems he was facing were psychiatric, or as we would prefer to put it now, psychological, or just human problems. And so he just gave up his regular general practice and became a psychotherapist. Terry, I want to say a little bit more. You're doing reform work all along, and you belong on a bunch of committees. But what Terry really wants to talk about, and this is such a privilege to do this with another therapist, is his psychotherapy practice, how it's evolved. And right now with the coronavirus, we are both doing telemedicine, but you've been doing telemedicine long before me. So I just started doing it by requirement of being in the house. Yeah. And I've enjoyed it a lot. I'm really enjoying seeing my patients and talking with them. It seems quite real to me. So Terry, talk about what you're doing and about your website.
Well, Peter, it's an honor to be on your show again. I always love talking with you, and you've been an inspiration in my life in so many ways since I read Toxic Psychiatry 30 years ago, and that did really change my life. I just morally and ethically could not continue working the way I was when, having read your book and a number of other books, which resonated so much with my own truth, my own emerging truth, really. So really, I've been on a journey, and it's taken me now to a place where I feel that the psychiatric approach to mental health is fundamentally diluted, really. And I believe that it causes far more problems, broadly speaking, than it solves. And I've evolved into a way of working now, which makes great sense to me and makes great sense to the people I work with. And it's quite straightforward in lots of ways. You mentioned earlier on, I think, in our conversation ourselves, about the humanness of this work. And that's an enormous part of my philosophy. What I do really is I try to be myself. I try to be myself with the client, with the person, two humans interacting, not even really a professional with a non-professional, two humans sharing the journey of life. And My starting point always is the rightness of people's experiences, the rightness, and seeking to make sense of how a person has arrived at where they've arrived at. And that approach has not failed me yet. Whether it's someone who's had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, OCD, and 80% of the people I work with, Peter, have already received a psychiatric diagnosis elsewhere, and they've sought me out for various reasons. And as you said, I've been doing online work now with clients for about 2 or 3 years, probably because a lot of the people I work with live a long way away from me. I work with people in other countries. I work with people in the north of Ireland, and it's hard for them to get to me. So I've been working online for quite a long time now, for at least 2 or 3 years. So
Terry, if one of the people watching this show, many of them here in the United States, would like to get in touch with you, you would work with them if you two reached an understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked with people in America. I've worked with people in Australia, Britain. Yeah.
How would they get in touch with you?
My email address is terry@drterrylynch.com. That's TERRY@DOCTOR, or through my website, which is www.drterrylynch.com, DOCTOR. There's a contact page on that website, on my website. Depending on, of course, if it was right to do so, if it was right the circumstances were correct. But I that's my approach, really, to start with. Let's make sense of the story. And whether it's delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, it all makes sense. And making sense of the person's story is a great starting point from which one can create a working plan, basically.
Could you give an example of how hallucinations make sense? And then let's think of something simpler, because I'm sure you see many people who aren't hallucinating actively or really totally out of touch with reality. But I think that hallucinations always make sense, and I think they largely go back to severe childhood trauma and can often be directly related to that trauma.
Yes, absolutely. Well, since you just mentioned it, a person comes into my mind who I worked with a few years ago who had a diagnosis of depression. And I think this is another thing I feel quite strongly about. I think it's reasonable to say, and I'll come back to what you asked me in a minute, but it's reasonable to say that in some ways, most and possibly all psychiatric diagnoses are misdiagnoses, because trauma is so frequently at the root of the experiences and behaviors that come to be described as depression or schizophrenia or any other psychiatric diagnosis. So I'm thinking of a girl who was in her early 20s, I think, who came to me with what was described as quite severe depression, but it was really trauma and unhealed trauma. And she told me one day that she had an experience where she was walking down a main street in Dublin and suddenly had this picture that everyone around, that the street was filled with dead people, and it was black and grey, and there were just bodies and corpses all around her. Now, she was walking through a street that was quite busy, and the street was not what she was seeing, but it was an expression of what was inside her, a kind of a projection of pain and sorrow and woundedness and despair being projected onto the screen of life. And that made complete sense to me, given her story. And that girl is now fully recovered, has a full life, and contacts me every now and then just to say hi. And I would have a lot of examples like that. And I think that's a very important starting point. Whereas you go to a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist hears that story. And a fundamental mistake psychiatrists make, Peter, is and doctors in general, they evaluate the story from their perspective. From their perspective, not the perspective of the client.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's so total.
Yeah.
Let me say, Terry, one of my recent blogs expresses the opinion that people really have to stop going to ordinary psychiatrists because they're just going to get misunderstood, and then they're going to get a neurotoxin. And I've talked about psychiatry now as an alternative reality, more bizarre. and more
Yes.
damaging than that of the patients.
I completely agree. And that the phrase I often use is that it's diluted, which is precisely what you're saying. It's a diluted system. Absolutely. So for me, that's a very powerful base to work from, that human experiences, all of them, are purposeful and make sense and can be worked with.
Let me make a couple of thoughts. I mean, you and I think so much alike. It's always fun. It's astonishing each time we talk, but it's also educational for me to hear you talk. Yeah. And I've more and more do see things as coming from trauma. But I've really expanded trauma to all the traditional things that happen to people, neglect, misunderstanding,
Absolutely.
losses, as well as outright abuse. And I think most people who develop an alternative reality are doing it as a combination of an escape from the horror, but also it always has elements of the horror. And I'm able to talk with people about, this voice you're hearing, who does it sound like? Where might it be from? And we go and we look at that and try to understand just where it all started. Do you do something similar to that?
Very similar. The words you're using are very similar to the words I use. And I agree completely with what you said about trauma. A word I frequently use is wounding. We humans get wounded a lot. We get wounded very easily. And I think, we're all wounded to certain degrees, but some people get wounded more than others. And a lot of wounding happens with a small W or a small T for trauma. It's not noticed. It's not intended often. Not all woundedness was done intentionally. And I think life, childhood, teenage years, they're pretty challenging. And so is life in general. So we humans can get wounded quite easily and quite silently. We don't have a currency in our societies for exploring hurt and wounding in society. Hurt is a very important word, I think. Absolutely. And I'm thinking of people I've worked with, for example, who create linkages and associations. And this is very common in, say, psychosis and schizophrenia, making linkages and associations. A common one is numbers, for example. People will link numbers. They will think they see certain numbers and they think they mean something. And I've frequently experienced that ultimately there's a desire of some sort in there, a desire to matter, a desire to be important, a desire to be significant. And all of these things that we call hallucinations and delusions, they're purposeful at some level. And this has struck me time and time again. And quite often I find that what's missing is the self, the sense of self. Quite often there's a seriously wounded sense of self in there, crying out for recognition, crying out for validation. So a lot of the work I do is trying to help the person come into their own validation, become their own validator, to see their own value unconditionally, so that they don't need these associations, these roundabout ways to get validation, approval. If you think of manic episodes, for example, many of them are linked in with the person coming to a place where they're feeling extremely important or extremely special, or having a very special purpose or role in that place, at that time. And I've regularly found that people in that situation, in their general life, feel the exact opposite. They feel utterly unimportant, powerless to change anything, like they don't matter. They feel lost in their life. They don't have a sense of being able to carve out meaning and purpose in their life. So it makes complete sense to me then that from time to time they might be tempted into this state that overcompensates for their normal, shall we say, typical, but very painful state of pain and powerlessness and distress. And most people I've worked with who've had, for example, manic episodes, would say that they enjoyed aspects of them and that they were alluring and tempting. And that makes complete sense to me.
Yeah,
so some of the work I do with people I work with, say, a diagnosis of bipolar, is to try to spot the early stages and to try to spot the very early stages, actually, and to try to come in and interrupt that flow, and to impose change, really, to impose change, to see the early stages, say, and because the patterns are often there repeatedly for the person. And if they can come in and interrupt that flow and go down a slightly different pathway at that time, and also go down a different pathway in their life in general, to work towards more meaning and purpose. And often that's quite frightening and scary for people. But there is a journey to be undertaken, and it is a journey that can be undertaken so long as it's done gently, gradually, with care, with gentle attention, if that makes sense.
I see it all the time in my practice. Very similarly, a person goes through a repetition of an earlier trauma, being rejected, being physically hurt,
Yes.
and all those terrible feelings come up, and then they begin to get a little high instead.
Yes.
Or somebody falls into a deep depression over a loss, and maybe they've recovered, and that gets repeated somehow, and then again, and it feels so unbearable to have these feelings of the humiliation or the loss. It could be almost any feeling that they then. It's almost like a mechanism that takes them over. That's how they experience it, but they begin to be happy. But the happy is a euphoria. It's artificial. But if you can redirect at that moment and say, I understand what, Jake, I understand what's happening. We've seen this. You're starting to get a little high, and you've just been through this trauma, and and then Jake might say, "Yeah, so you want me to talk about my feelings, right?" I said, "Yeah, give it a try. give it a try," and you negotiate. You work with the person to help them have their real feelings, which they can then master again. But it's like a seduction that the person imposes on themselves to go off into grandiosity, and it's really quite amazing.
I think it can become a trusted pattern for the person. One thing that has struck me quite frequently that people say to me when they go into, say, a manic state or a psychosis, manic state, psychosis to a degree, that often, particularly at the early stages, their anxiety goes. So they go from, what you're saying there, having very intense feelings, to not having that anxiety and suddenly feeling wonderful, particularly going into a manic state, the early stages. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's quite interesting that switch contains within it relief from awful anxiety and overwhelm. And my hunch is that we operate on a number of levels, and one of the levels I feel we operate from is a very deep but profoundly wise level, which prompts us into certain choices, or at least invites us into certain choices. And I have a feeling that that's what's going on, sometimes at least, in that situation. I don't think it's a coincidence that quite often people go into manic states in situations where they're feeling stress or they're feeling overwhelm, or, as you said, they could be experiencing either overwhelming emotions or the distinct possibility of overwhelming emotions that terrify the person. And to me, it makes some sense that at some level inside them, they see another way of dealing with this. And that is to just bring themselves out of that awful situation into a false situation, but making it feel real, and then going down that pathway. But of course, because it's not grounded in reality, if the person continues to go down that pathway, the likelihood is that it's going to lead to some chaos over a period of a few days if it's not addressed.
Yeah, so much so. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that having that person engaged with you in a trusting way is so critical. And because the opposite of alternative reality is actually a trusting engagement, a loving, caring engagement. And I think those are two places we humans go into. On the one hand, we can be in a loving, engaging way, communicated to people and draw people to trusting to enter into that. Or you can have an alternative reality in which you're not really relating to people, but you're so overwhelmed by what you're dealing with, you go into an alternative reality.
Yeah.
And I've not said this before, but that's, I think, what happens to our colleagues in psychiatry. They have no idea how to deal with the things we're talking about. Many of them don't have the skills to engage. They themselves are very aloof or wounded, or they wouldn't do what they do. They wouldn't want to drug everybody's feelings away if they weren't trying to do something to their own feelings.
Yeah.
And
of course, psychiatry is an ideology, isn't it? It's an ideology. It's like a religion. And you sign up and you become part of the religion. And I think there's quite a pressure on psychiatrists to conform to the ideology. And the core theme of the ideology, and it's diluted, is that the experiences and behaviors that we're dealing with here are fundamentally biological. And that, to me, is a diluted starting point. But I think it's essential for the maintenance of psychiatry's power in the world. So therefore, they put the priorities of the ideology above the priorities of the client. Now, I think a lot of psychiatrists aren't aware that they're doing that consciously, but I think that is what's going on. I think that to approach people the way we're talking about, I think you need to free yourself of investment, really. And I think psychiatry is so invested in itself and in its ideologies that it's extremely difficult and challenging for psychiatrists to even contemplate what we're talking about. But if people are to be truly helped, the type of dialogue we're having needs to become mainstream. It really does.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Now, I'd like to shift it a little bit to make clear that these processes we're talking about, these things we're experiencing, are also part of everyday life. So a given person may have, picked, I don't know, if you just tap somebody in the shoulders walking along the street in a busy metropolitan area, probably a significant percentage have had some real crisis where they've, and it's funny that when you do epidemiological studies, 20-30% of people report experiences that psychiatrists would diagnose as psychotic. They've heard voices, or they have a deep religious belief that doesn't necessarily fit with an established religion, or they have a deep fear of some sort. So we're really, first of all, talking very much on a level that many human beings experience, perhaps not as intensively to seek help for it or to be hospitalized and get drugged by a psychiatrist. The other thing is that on some level, I think all human beings are struggling with some very similar critical issues. And I've been trying to boil it down lately in my older years. And I have an article coming out that I'll send to you, Terry. We're talking with Terry Lynch from Ireland. And try to and have you read it. But the fundamental principle of it is twofold. First, that we human beings struggle with helplessness, and ultimately with helplessness over controlling our minds, our thoughts, and our feelings. And that the deepest helplessness that people struggle with, and I really am interested in your feedback on this, that the deepest helplessness that we struggle with has to do with not believing we're deserving of love. And I know that from myself. I certainly know in myself that the most profound struggle growing up was feeling undeserving of love. And not just feeling unlovable, which could be for many reasons. You think your looks or your age or something make you unlovable, your income level, whatever. But rather a feeling that somehow fundamentally we don't deserve love. And I think that's religion tries to address that, good religion, very deeply. Have you thought along those lines or something similar to that?
Yeah, I have. Many things you've prompted many things in my mind. The first bit you talked about there prompted me to think about the whole concept of normal and abnormal, and that in you were I think kind of saying really that these experiences are normal in the sense that high numbers of people have experienced these experiences and exhibit these behaviors, and that's absolutely my starting point. To me, there's no abnormal. It's a matter of this experience, this behavior is part of this person's life structure. And so we work with that. There's no question of pathologizing or making something abnormal. It's there for a reason. It's purposeful at some level. And that's always my starting point. And a lot of what people present to us or what people experience is their best solution as they see it to a situation. And yes, it may be in some ways causing more problems, but it's often their best solution as they see it. And therefore, I think recognizing that then now opens up a dialogue to what other solutions might be available. And linking into what you said about, you mentioned the word helplessness, and I was thinking that before you said it. When I was a student, Peter, and you may remember this, but certainly when I was a student in medical school, one of the commonest used phrases in psychiatry was learned helplessness. And I think that's a great phrase, but it's I don't think it's really in the psychiatric dialect anymore.
No,
But it's so
I never
it's
heard
so
it in
true.
all my training.
Yeah, I certainly did, and I read it in many books. And
I mean,
that to me,
in developing my concept of emotional helplessness, back in,
yeah,
way back in the 1980, I published about that. I discovered that there was a parallel development of learned helplessness. They
yes,
don't make it as
absolutely.
broad as I think you and I do. I
And every person I've worked with, I would say virtually every person in 20 years with a psychiatric diagnosis has felt helpless to varying degrees, but usually to a large degree, and has felt powerless. And to me, I work a lot with powerlessness and power because I think that's very much an important part of the recovery process. People recovering their power. I think it's not so much that people truly lose their power, actually. I think what happens is that the idea of being powerful becomes too frightening. And so some people at least just disconnect from being powerful because it's too scary. It's too risky to be powerful. Having power in the past may have got them into trouble, for example. So it's too scary to risk. And this leads into the last bit I want to say about this. If there's a common denominator with a majority, perhaps the vast majority of people I've worked with any psychiatric diagnosis, in terms of one of their main priorities in life, it is to minimize risk taking because they have reached a point where risk taking is now something that they perceive and have experienced as very terrifying. And I think that may link into the thing of not deserving love, for some people at least, that if I convince myself that I don't deserve love, then I won't risk loving. And I think so. If that makes sense, it's like I'm preempting the risk by convincing myself I'm not lovable. Um, and I've worked with a lot of people who have had a lot of hurt around love, absolutely, and have come to the conclusion they're not lovable. And it's a deep wound. You're dead right. It's a deep wound. But I think a lot of people then have such fear around risking because they are dreading the annihilation of rejection, etc. So one of the things I try to do with people is cultivate self-love, cultivate them being there for themselves, so that if something happens in relation to love, they have someone to fall back on themselves. Because you mentioned, or we were talking about trauma and wounding. Over the years, I've noticed, and I've noticed this is a recurring theme, that one of the consequences of trauma and wounding is a wounded sense of self. And if my sense of self is very wounded, as it was in my teenage years, then it's very hard for me to see that I'm lovable. And it's also very hard for me to risk loving. And I don't, because I'm so scared, I'm now putting my heart on a plate and I'm putting me on a plate for someone else. And I'm terrified that they will drop me or wound me, and then I will be absolutely devastated. So I have found in the work, and I've helped a lot of people around love in this area, that if you can cultivate, if the person can cultivate a real sense of having their own back, and being there for themselves, no matter what, then the area of love becomes somewhat more explorable, shall we say, and a little less risky for devastation and annihilation. I regularly find that people who are terrified of loving, that a lot of it has to do with having no one to fall back on, nothing in here to fall back on. So if I risk loving and it doesn't work out, oh my God, I am annihilated. So that is something I have found very useful in the work. And I know from my own life, and you may know it as well, Peter, that, if we come to the conclusion that I'm not lovable, then the journey out from that is terrifying. Terrifying. So that is why I work so much with people, to cultivate a sense of self, and also to cultivate a kind of a medium-term approach to things. I do that a lot with people. So that if I've worked with people, say, for example, who've never had a girlfriend, or in their late 20s, and explored, well, how can we strategically work with that? And taking the heat off the individual situation. A lot of people who have great doubt about themselves in relation to sexuality or relationships will often pin everything on the next interaction. Everything. So if the next interaction goes badly, that's absolute devastation. So what I tend to say to people is, no, just look at the fact that you've actually done something. It's like reshaping goal setting and reshaping how we measure success. I do that a lot in my work. I do that a lot in my courses, actually, to just take the heat off individual situations, so that they're no longer like Mount Everest, that if it doesn't work, I'm not devastated. I have something to fall back on, someone to fall back on, and that's me. If I don't have me in the world, I am lost. And so many of us have been wounded to the point where we've lost trust in being there for ourselves proactively, if that makes sense, in the world. Sorry to go on so much.
Oh, I would have let you go on for the whole remainder of the show. I just think everything you're saying is going to mean something to people. And I feel very much that this is a part of ordinary living. I can feel in myself if something, I'm pretty fragile in some ways, and if something goes wrong between me and a loved one, I can very easily, at my mature age, fall back into feeling unlovable, not unloved, but really like there's something the matter again. And that just draws on so many years of actually experiencing it,
Yes.
in my family.
Yes.
So it's, I think that what we're talking about, it's not about psychiatric patients, and I know you'll agree with this. I'm just saying this for the folks. It's about us, and it's the other thing is, you were talking about power. I really like the way you said that people are afraid to have power, and I think that's an everyday occurrence with people.
Yes.
I think very daily we have to make decisions, and we get scared of taking a powerful position, whether it's with our children or our loved one or at work. I recently stepped out much more into the political arena, and Ginger did too. We kind of did it together because we felt that the stuff we'd done in psychiatry, we could also help in regard to the coronavirus epidemic, because it's science. There's a lot of science that connects to people. And, you and I, Terry, we do science that connects to people.
Yes, absolutely.
And both Ginger and I, at different moments, fortunately not together, but at different moments with each other, got very, very scared about leaving behind what we've done for so long, which in fact at times has been absolutely terrifying, but going into a new risking of identity and attack. And I think this just happens in all the things we're talking about: not feeling deserving of love, not daring to be powerful, not daring to love because it will lay on the line whether you're lovable, and so on. This is the stuff of life, and that's what I want folks to understand. Do you have more to say about that? Because I'm sure you're dealing with a number of people who are not particularly disturbed,
Yeah.
But these are issues for us all.
Absolutely, you're so right. That issue of power and the fear of it is comes into life in so many different ways. One of the things I've noticed is you take something like depression or anxiety, you know, and I don't even like using those terms that much, but one of the things I've learned is that many people have their own set of fears, and they're everyday fears, and they come up every day. And they
Yes.
often involve, say, not expressing opinions or not daring to say or do anything that someone else might disapprove of or disagree with. And nobody else knows about that person's fears because they're held quietly, and the person is just getting on with their life, so other people don't really notice. They might think, oh, that's just a very easygoing person, or, you know, he just doesn't have opinions, whatever. And I think one of the things we do, and you kind of touched on it earlier on, we bring with us the remnants, shall we say, of our past, our hurts, our woundings that maybe we haven't fully healed, or there's some loose ends around them that they haven't been brought full circle. And I think quite often what we humans do is we bring the experiences we've had and the pain of the experiences into our now, and we interact with our now as though these things could happen at any time and overwhelm us or hurt us again.
Yes.
So I do a lot of work with people around the now, around their current situations, their current interactions, things that many people might think are absolutely insignificant. I was working with a person not so long ago who told me that it's a person with a diagnosis of depression, a term, as I said, I'm suspicious of for lots of reasons. But there were about 3 or 4 things he just mentioned to me that he never did. He never answered the doorbell. He never answered his phone to unknown numbers. He never returned goods to stores. And they were all linked to protecting himself in case that any of those things would result in him exposing himself to criticism, to wounding again. And this was all to do with stuff that had in the past. But they were affecting him. They were affecting his perception of himself. I often explore with people how they see themselves in terms of 2 phrases: I can and I can't. And the more I can't I have in my psyche about myself, the more restricted my life becomes, and the more pain I suffer as a result, because I'm living more and more through my defenses in a self-protective way. So we worked with those simple things. And in addition to asking him to do the things he wasn't doing, such as answer the doorbell, etc., and then integrating and assimilating the safety of the whole process. It's not enough to just do them. It's to validate and reassure. Yeah, I felt anxious before I did it, but I did it and it worked out okay. So actually, I felt unsafe, but I was safe. And that kind of thing, working with people to help them change their perception of themselves. In particular, to change their perception of I can and I can't, towards more and more, actually, maybe I can. And in that process, people realize quite often, wow, oh, so I was actually safe doing that. So maybe I can use this approach to other areas of my life in small steps, not giant leaps. But to me, a lot of pain and distress that people experience that they end up seeing psychiatrists for is about unfulfilledness in their life. And I think that is an important aspect of unfulfilledness, when we've come to conclusions about ourselves based on our story and our woundedness, that there's a lot of things I can't do. And even the thing about relationships, that's part of it. And so we often go into self-protection as our main priority in our lives, particularly in certain areas. And of course that makes sense. But if that goes on for year after year after year, and somebody finds themselves in their 30s or 40s or 50s, and they have held back from risking to love, for example, the pain that causes is often far, far more than the pain they might have experienced if they addressed this issue in a methodical way earlier in their life. And it's never too late, Peter. I mean, people can address these issues in their 40s, 50s, 60s, A few years ago, I worked with a man.
Well, we got to go up a little more. I'm 83.
I know, and 80,
And
yeah.
I'm
Okay.
working. I'm addressing.
A few years ago, I was working with a man with a bipolar diagnosis who made a full recovery in the work with me, and he got engaged in his late 60s. Late 60s. So it's never too late. One must be realistic, but it literally is never too late, because there is such power in the now and such potential in the now. But if we're living feeling we must protect ourselves as our number one priority, then by definition, we're going to miss out on opportunities. But I think in order for people to take those opportunities, the fear they experience, the reluctance must be respected as a starting point. It must be respected because they've come to that conclusion for good reasons based on how their life has evolved.
I literally feel it is never too late. And I remember in my internship and my residency, sometimes I had opportunities I've never had again because I was actually seeing people really at the end stage. And I remember as a medical intern having a patient who had cancer surgery, believed she couldn't eat anymore. The surgeon thought she could. It was around her esophagus, and told her family she didn't want to see them anymore, and put up an order not to let the family in. And I spent some time with her and encouraged her to eat. I sat on the bed with her, which I presume nowadays I might not even risk, giving how much restrictions are placed on relationship. But I fed her, and she got to eating. And then I told her that it would mean a lot to her family if she would have them come. And explained that to her. And she said, "No, I look so awful." And I said, "Well, they've asked me to come and ask you." And I witnessed the getting together of the families. And she lived for only a few weeks. And during that time, she had people in her room all the time. And she was smiling, she was happy, she was feeling loved, and she passed away in a very, a good death, not a horrible one. So really, it's just never too late. No. And I just think that's so important.
And you met her, Peter, where she needed to be met. That sounds to me like shock. She was, the shock of everything and the distress and the challenge she was facing, and perhaps it was just too much to feel her own feelings, maybe. And if she met her family, she might cry and get upset, etc. But you met her with compassion, and you talk a lot about compassion. You've written books about compassion, and you bring that into your work. And compassion melts defenses, and the connection you made with her, so important. It's not rocket science. It's humanness, the thing we started with.
Terry, I've said this before when you've been on the air with me, but of all the therapists I know and talk with, I feel like you and I are more on a similar understanding than anyone else I know. And I also learned from you. I love the way you put things. And it's like, how could we not learn from each other? And in fact, I might ask some of my clients or patients to listen to this so they can hear somebody else talk about some of these issues. Do you have many people you can talk to who are therapists that you're really comfortable with in terms of this whole array of the critique of psychiatry and then helping people in a caring and empathic way?
I do online, I suppose. Well, my wife, Marianne, who you met at the beginning, Marianne's a therapist and would very much share my perspective. But online, people like
Maybe I'll have you on together.
Maybe. Yes.
Yeah. Well, of course, I do know her. That's great. But I've never talked with her about therapy.
Oh yeah. Well, she's a therapist and a great therapist and a wonderful advocate.
And I've worked with her in that organization we were building.
So a lot of support in that group. But I suppose I'm kind of used to being somewhat on my own
Sure.
That might be the wrong, because as a doctor, after all, I'm a doctor, and I literally, in lots of ways, walked away from my profession in the late 1980s and trained to become a psychotherapist. I did an MA in psychotherapy, but none of my colleagues came with me, and I was chatting away to a lot of friends I had as GPs in Limerick, and while many of them agreed with me to a point, I continued. I went much further than they did. So I'm not unfamiliar with the road less traveled, shall we say, and I'm quite comfortable on it, really, because many years ago I made a commitment to truth, and I made truth my main priority, really, and that has stood me very, very well, and I will continue to do that. And I'm very aware that there are lots of reasons why people have their own belief systems, many reasons, and I'm okay with that. I think that but for me, as I said, and then the truth matters. And then when I work with people, and virtually every day I see the impact that this work has on people, and many of the people I work with, Peter, have worked with other people, and yet within 2 or 3 sessions they say to me, nobody's put it to me the way you have.
Yes,
And
I hear that all the time.
Yeah, nobody's been able to illuminate it the way you have.
Yeah.
So that kind of validation of truth, that's not egotistical validation. It's it's validation of truth. And so once I'm satisfied I'm on the path of truth, I'm fine. I one of the reasons I did walk away from being a GP in a thriving practice was my own spiritual journey, I think. And I had often asked myself, well, and this was in my late 30s, someday I'm going to be on my deathbed, and I want to be able to say to myself, looking back, that I lived an honest life. And if I had stayed within the system I was working within, the medical system, I wouldn't be able to say that to myself.
We share so much in common. Ginger and I have conversations about this, especially when we decided to take on some of the issues surrounding the coronavirus and American politics. And we so much talked about, well, it's the truth. I mean, we think this is the truth, and other people are afraid to say it, especially anybody with scientific and medical credentials. So let's talk about the treatments. Let's talk about what's going on, and let's reference it as we can, and go ahead and contribute as we can. So I think it's lifelong
Yes.
that we continue to re-examine. Are we on the right path? Are we doing what's true? And for me, what I'm sort of supposed to do, I really believe. I don't know if you do, but I really believe in a higher power. I actually call the higher power God. I mean, I'm not supposed to do that in the Western world today very much,
Sure.
but
Sure.
I really believe that I have some purpose that I'm supposed to be doing, and I can look back now and say, and by God, I've spent 60 plus years doing it, and feel pleased about that.
Yeah, me too. Same thing.
I wish I could. I wish more of the people who came to see me believed that there was something greater than themselves that they could also experience as loving them, because I think there's self-love and there's love of others, but if you can believe there's love in the universe in some way, and I think that's what God is to me. God is to me that there's some source of love in this universe that infuses us and infuses animate beings and life, and
Sure.
it's an old idea, and it's a part of Christian and Jewish religion and tradition, and so you have some of those same feelings?
I do. I haven't really made up my mind, to be honest, about God, etc. But I certainly have a sense of something deeper, something richer, something very much. And I mentioned earlier on about that deep wisdom that we have, that we're not even aware of. And I think that's amazing. I think we are remarkable as human beings. I think we are extraordinary, really. And I think that in the developing the type of self-love I'm talking about, it's coming into more of an awareness of that. And I think that can help people trust. I think trust again comes into this. And trust comes into so much of this. If a person's been extremely wounded in life, they can find it hard to trust in anything, including a God. And then some other people who've been very wounded will maybe go to the other side of that coin and become profoundly trusting in God as they perceive God, but very untrusting in the world and perhaps shy away from the world. So it's a difficult dilemma for people. I know in my own life, in terms of purpose, when I was younger, I think I could have been a very, very good golfer. I was a very good golfer. I was and still am to a degree quite a good musician. And I think I could have made careers out of those. But the trauma that I experienced in my own life, in my childhood, my teenage years, interfered with those processes. And now, in my 60s, I'm 62, when I look back, I think I am so happy my life took the path it did, because I'm doing what I love doing. And I'm not sure that's a complete coincidence. So the idea of some level of guidance, etc., I would certainly be open to that. I think, though, that one needs to be perhaps open to hearing and listening. And I think sometimes it's about attuning to hear the wisdom again. And maybe that's linked to a higher power. I'm not quite sure. But I think for me, I'm so happy that, that I'm not happy I was traumatized. I experienced trauma, exactly. But experiencing that trauma took me down a pathway. And it was up to me to open the doors. I had to open the doors. I know that. But I did. And it took me into a life that is so filled with richness in human experience. I feel so privileged to do this work and to sit in front of people who are sharing the most precious things in their life with me. I mean, that is such a precious and privileged place to be. I wouldn't give that up for anything. It's wonderful. So I absolutely agree with you in terms of, finding myself doing what is perfect for me, or what is absolutely right.
It's a wonderful finishing note. And again, we share this so much, including this belief that it's really a precious thing that we have. It's a privilege that we can talk with other human beings and they'll open their hearts and we can share, we can try to help and try to understand and learn in the process. And Terry Lynch, thank you for being in my life. What a joy to move from talking to you on the radio to talking to you on radio TV, folks.
It's lovely. Yes, it is lovely. And Peter, I have such fond feelings towards you and Ginger. You've been part of my life 25, 30 years, really. And you will never know, really, how much you influence my changes. Your book, Toxic Psychiatry, and Lucy Johnstone's book, Users and Abusers of Psychiatry. I read those two books on holidays. And it just confirmed and validated where I was heading anyway. But you've played a huge part of my life. I'm very glad to have you in my life, Peter. And I'm really glad we crossed paths.
Thank you. And thank you, my wonderful audience, for sharing this lovely almost an hour with us. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye across the ocean.
Bye. Great to talk to you.
Okay, it's over. I'm still running, just so you know, I'm still running the recording, just in case we need it for something. But I'm going to hang up and send this to Ian. I think it's going to be one of my best interviews. My interviews with you are really terrific. And this is a great book. And it's a great bookend to the one I did with Bob, because, he's not a therapist. And this is such a great balance to that. Thank you. And if you don't hear from me often enough, just say, hey, I wouldn't mind talking to you on the TV radio.
All right. Peter, it's lovely. Take care.
Lovely. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.